Day night, the vice presidential nominees, Senator Kaine and Mike Pence, held their only debate of the 2016 campaign, moderated by Elaine Quijano of CBS. Our chief television critic, James Poniewczak, and our media columnist, Jim Rutenberg, caught up with each other on Wednesday morning to discuss how the bottom-of-the-ticket debate played on screen. James Poniewczak: before the first Clinton-Trump debate, we were all at DEFCON 1 over fact-checking. There was pushback against the idea that moderators should fact-check at all, some of it from the Commission on Presidential Debates itself, and a lot of agitation for fact-checking, especially from supporters of Hillary Clinton. Donald J. Trump has, repeatedly, had an entrepreneurial relationship with facts. But fact-checking, and the lack thereof, felt like a bigger issue Tuesday, particularly when Mr. Kaine and Mr. Pence clashed over quotes Mr. Kaine attributed to his opponents. There was a lot of cross-talk. Who knew America's dad, Tim Kaine, was so feisty? And Ms. Quijano had a hard time keeping the candidates on topic, much less correcting anyone. "Senator Kaine, Governor Pence, please?" she chided at one point. Another thing that struck me was how often Mr. Pence simply chose to ignore Mr. Kaine's slams against Mr. Trump's controversial comments. His go-to move was, instead, to ruefully shake his head in the split screen. That's not technically a statement, but on TV, body language can be more powerful than words. A shake of the head, to the lay viewer, says, "That's silly." He never said that, says it, possibly, more powerfully than a spoken denial. Continue reading the main story. Presidential election 2016: the latest news and analysis of the candidates and issues shaping the presidential race. After clash of number twos, both campaigns say, "We re-number one OCT5. That Mexican thing takes on life after the debate." OCT5 debate takeaways. Tim Kaine presses Mike Pence on Russia, but not gay rights. OCT5 fact check. The vice presidential debate. OCT5 who won the debate. Commentators give edge to Mike Pence. OCT5 see more. So my first questions are, did you think Ms. Quijano got steamrolled? Is it fair to expect a moderator to be able to fact-check documented statements in real time? And how do you fact-check a head shake? Jim Rutenberg: there's no question that fact-checking was in short supply last night. In a way it wasn't at the first debate. As you said, Jim P., it's a little hard to fact-check body language. But there were more than a few points at which Ms. Quijano could have said, "Governor Pence, I see you re-shaking your head." But Mr. Trump did say after the split screen made short work of Mr. Trump in the first debate, simply turning him into an agitated man in a box. As you wrote, Mr. Pence used it to brilliant advantage, but often in service of denying something that was true. A casual viewer could have easily seen Mr. Pence shaking his head in denial as Mr. Kaine repeated something Mr. Trump actually said, and think it was in dispute. As for Ms. Quijano, I think at times she did, actually, get steamrolled. For instance, after Mr. Kaine asserted that Mr. Trump wanted to use a deportation force to eject all undocumented immigrants, Mr. Pence said, "That's nonsense." Of course, Mr. Trump did for a sustained period of time this year advocate for a deportation force, though he and his advisors have more recently narrowed its scope. Tuesday night offered a good chance for some better definition. And Ms. Quijano did begin to interject, "Governor, Mr. Trump has said," but Mr. Pence just talked right over her and she never came back to it. She also, for instance, let Mr. Kaine say Mr. Trump wants to privatize Social Security based on his book of 16 years ago. He has proposed no such thing in this campaign. This debate will, and should, renew the discussion over the moderator's responsibility to fact-check. They have to do it to a reasonable extent. Poniewczak: there's the school of thought, expressed by the anchor Chris Wallace and the Trump campaign, that a moderator should let the candidates fact-check each other. We saw what can happen when you do that. Several times, Mr. Kaine told viewers they could go to the tape and see for themselves that Mr. Trump said something that, in fact, Mr. Trump said. But who has time to go to the tape? You're already watching a vice presidential debate instead of the baseball playoffs. You've got work in the morning. Only the invested, and likely the already decided, are going to do that sort of extra credit. A vice presidential debate is an odd bird, to begin with, of course, since the real competitors are not even on stage. But Mr. Trump made himself a presence anyway, as is his wont, by live tweeting the debate. Mostly, he retweeted followers. "Kaine looks like an evil crook out of the Batman movies," one wrote. "Shades of Lincoln, Douglas." As for the two candidates actually present, Mr. Kaine attacked often, but clumsily, armed with Kensingers like, "You are Donald Trump's apprentice." He was the guy who has to yell at his neighbor about playing his stereo too loudly, doesn't he, like to do it, and so blusters through it awkwardly. Mr. Pence, the former talk radio host, was the smoother, more polished presence, but often had a peculiar strategy regarding his running mate, Donald who? Were these two guys even having the same debate? Rutenberg, there is no question that Mr. Pence was the far smoother debater, and he was certainly helped by his years as a radio talk show host. So he had a far better presentation, far better. And there's a temptation to score the debate for him based on his presentation. But that goes to the whole issue people have brought up this year, about scoring the debates based on style rather than substance. And there was quite a bit of that going on in Pundit.And last night. Of course, what matters most is how swing voters score at Ohio. Swing voters, who participated in a focus group-style viewing session for CBS News, overwhelmingly handed the debate to Mr. Pence, using words like calm and polished to describe his performance. Almost all of them had said they believed Hillary Clinton won last week. Most of the members of a CNN focus group said that Mr. Kaine won despite Mr. Pence's better demeanor. Before the debate, they said they had been looking for substance from the candidates. But, as the CNN host Jake Tapper pointed out, the focus group was in Mr. Kaine's home state of Virginia, and may have been inclined to lean his way, which raises the question, then why have the focus group there? As for the actual substance, again, Mr. Pence did repeatedly deny either outright or through the shake of his head quotes Mr. Kaine accurately attributed to Trump, many of which have defined Mr. Trump's candidacy. His tough talk about Russia, the Russian President Vladimir Putin, was jarring, coming after Mr. Trump's professed admiration for the Russian leader. It drew a Pence breaks with Trump on Putin headline from Politico. His denials that Mr. Trump had praised Mr. Putin were still more surprising. And in that regard, Mr. Kaine seemed to score more points on the facts when it came to the top of the ticket, which is what he was there for. That brings me to your question of whether they were having the same debate. They had different jobs last night. Mr. Kaine was there to put Mr. Pence on the spot by making him defend Mr. Trump's more controversial statements and record, which Mr. Pence didn't really do, either denying they were ever uttered, or just choosing not to engage. But Mr. Pence's job was to present himself as a level-headed grown-up who could assume the presidency either in the next 4 years, or, as many talking heads speculated last night, in 2020. They both seemed to do what they set out to do. Ponywozik put another way, Mr. Kaine made the case against Donald Trump. Mr. Pence made the case for Mr. Pence. Either way, the debate was not the stuff of West Wing political fantasy. Mr. Kaine flailed, Mr. Pence denied, and Ms. Quijano jumped from question to question, without much productive follow-up. It did have its moments, particularly toward the end, when the two openly religious candidates talked about their faith and abortion. For a few minutes, they laid out their positions on an issue they deeply disagree on, with some measure of introspection. Maybe it was the sort of debate they would prefer to have had. It's probably the one many folks would prefer to have heard. The first thing people ask after a debate is, who won? That's a weird meta question, because people don't mean the same thing by it. One in this case can mean was more persuasive on substance, or seemed to dominate in style, or made me more likely to vote for him, or made me think he made other people more likely to vote for him. But as we saw last week, a debate is often won or lost, whatever that means, in the days afterward, in the punditry, in late-night satire, in the candidates' reactions. From my armchair, it looked as if the Clinton campaign loaded up Mr. Kaine with oppo research grenades, in the hope of either getting video clips of Mr. Pence defending Mr. Trump's controversies, or refusing to, or goading Mr. Trump. into a spree, like the one he went on against the former Miss Universe Alicia Machado? Rutenberg. Yup. My biggest misgiving, when I would write debate night stories back in my last job as a political correspondent, was that whatever I thought immediately after the debate might prove wrong, or at least off kilter, in the clear light of the real polls, voter reactions, and late-night comedy. Immediately after the last debate you knew that Mr. Trump had had a bad night. But you didn't know how bad it really was until you saw polls, like those out of Pennsylvania, that showed Mrs. Clinton's support spiking there. Then again, this was a vice presidential debate, and hardly a riveting one, so you have to wonder how far it goes. Pony Wozik. It doesn't look like this debate has that much of a media afterlife. But ask me that again if Mr. Trump jumps on Twitter at 3:20 a.m. tomorrow. This recording was